Good to see you. I'll sit between you. No, that wasn't. That's all I can say. I mean, here, take mine. There's none of these left. Did I go make some more or something?
No, hang on. Don't hand those out. Sorry.
Don't hand
Those
them.
are those my
No, making meaning.
that's Mark. Mark did he print some off?
Well, there was a pile back there and what I'm saying is I just took
He
the
said
last
that he
one.
didn't need one. So yeah, let's do you know how to use the copier?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, why is that not on? Good morning, Debbie. Can you hear me? You are on mute if you are speaking.
Do it there. Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you for checking.
Welcome, Liz. Good to see you here as well. It's always like a seance. Are you there? Can you hear me? Anyway, we won't speak of such demonic things. Is everyone warm enough, or shall I turn the fire on? Warm enough? Okay, all right. And Mark, do you need to do anything? Yes, absolutely. I think I've got a good one.
What you do?
They all know, and then they appeared. I don't know.
First thing
They were able to took the last one off the table and I thought they were all gone, so now I made more, so now we got time. So.
Really?
Quickly on a daily thing.
Oh, yeah, daily office?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure they'll be able to help us, but they haven't been. And put them up on. I will, those are there in case they're having somebody else.
Okay. Well, thank you, Roger. Yeah, we haven't had the daily office in the chapel since pre-pandemic, so.
It may be something different, because there's still a bunch of guys on the way, so that. Extra.
Okay.
In case they somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for that. And thank you for setting up with Betsy. Great. Well, Mark, it's 9 o'clock. Shall we begin? Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for attending our first installment of this Lenten series of how we make meaning of our suffering. And we're delighted that Dr. Mark McInroy will kick off this series. If you picked up one of the Lenten Reads, you've got a bookmark there, and on that bookmark, you will see the 5 Sundays that we are offering this 9 o'clock forum with a wonderful set of presenters. So please come to as many of those as possible, and please follow on the other side of the bookmark the reading schedule for the Viktor Frankl Man's Search for Meaning. So thank you all for attending. I will open us in prayer, and then Dr. Mark McInroy will lead us. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray a prayer attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for being here. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark McInroy, and I have the privilege of kicking us off on this series, Making Meaning Out of Suffering, which, of course, takes on an enormously challenging topic, and we will not arrive at a nice solution after the course of our weeks of dealing with it. My hope, though, is that we do genuinely acquire some resources that can be applied to our contemporary situation. And indeed, for those of you who have made your way through some of the Frankl text, it does nothing if not relativize one's own sense of suffering and challenge in the world. And I think it's an incredibly rich set of ideas for us to navigate our way through. So what you can see on the handout that has gone around the room, and it looks like everyone is set there. If you're not, there are a few, I think, in the back of the room here, is a structure for how I envision our time, and then a few key quotations from Man's Search for Meaning. So what I'd like to do as a gambit with the series as a whole, really, is to talk about the problem of evil in Christian theology, and then the so-called soul-making defense in response to the problem of evil. That, to my mind, is very much in play in the midst of what Frankl is doing. And so I think we do well to know just the general contours of how this argument goes, how the problem and solution, to the extent that it is a solution, goes. And then that will kind of set the stage, and then we can get into Frankl's text. It seems to me that what we have with Frankl is a narrative that is progressively more and more meaningful, more and more hopeful. One has to get up front these incredibly inhumane conditions in which he and his fellow prisoners are existing. We get that for the first, really, the selection that I was assigned to speak on is almost exclusively that bleakness, right? So I've taken it upon myself, and I hope that folks won't mind, future presenters won't mind. I've gone a bit deeper into the text because I think we get some material there that really serves us. So it's kind of a crescendo, really, I think. But where that crescendo begins, to my mind, is encapsulated, I hope, with Roman numeral 2 here. These ways in which Frankl manages to find humanity in the deeply inhuman world that he is forced to navigate. And there are a few ways in which that happens. The first one toward which he gestures concerns the inner life of the prisoner. And he speaks about those who have a rich inner life being actually better equipped to survive these horrific conditions. And then he talks about humor, which I think, you've by the time you get to, it's on page 41 that he starts to bring this up. By the time you get there, you've been in, page after page, it's real grimness. And so that the humor struck me certainly powerfully, I think, and as a contrast to that. And again, might be a resource for us. And then for the final 2 points here, I wanted to talk about a reappropriation of Nietzsche. So for those of you who were here for iterations of the previous series, a lot of talk about Nietzsche and his assessment of, as he puts it, the slave morality, which is a kind of bitter way of approaching life that tries to call one's oppressors evil, and in so doing, kind of gets caught up in a victim mindset. Right? It is not quite ironic, but it certainly is thrilling, maybe, to see Frankl reappropriating Nietzsche, who has so many aspersions on this slave morality, which he thought began within Judaism and then got carried into Christianity. We actually see Frankl using Nietzsche as a resource for his own moving through suffering in some ways that I think are powerful. So Nietzsche is a complicated figure. He's just one caustic criticism after another. There's something ultimately therapeutic that he's aiming at that one could be forgiven for not quite seeing in the midst of all those critiques. It seems to me Frankl gets the best of Nietzsche and uses it in a situation that, again, might be useful for us in some way in our setting. All right, so that's what's coming. Let's talk relatively briefly about the problem of evil and the soul-making defense in Christian theology. So the problem of evil is one of those topics that is notoriously thorny, notoriously difficult, does not admit of an easy solution within Christian theology. It's worth appreciating, I think, the context in which it unfolds and ultimately the hope that it puts forward. Right? So that is to say, the problem of evil only becomes a problem when you have a couple of other features of God that are insisted upon, specifically the notion that God is omnipotent and the notion that God is omnibenevolent, as it's sometimes put, are all good. Right? So if you have an all-good God who's all-powerful, then yes, you've got a challenge on your hands when it comes to the problem of evil. It's worth mentioning that there's a certain audacity for Christian theology to even say these things about the God who is the author of our world. That is to say, other ways of thinking in the time period in which Christianity is taking root would, in one sense, resolve this problem rather tidily, but do so in an unsatisfactory way. And what I mean by that is they would claim in various ways that the God who was kind of in charge of at least the Christian life was not in fact all powerful. So this God, for instance, did not create the universe as a whole. This God kind of stumbled upon a mess, just to kind of put it informally, in the sense that there was a kind of chaotic matter that needed to be shaped or formed, but God wasn't the author of all creation. And so there was, within other cosmologies, other theologies of the time, a dualism, whereby you had, yes, a good God who was trying God's best to, make things better. But that God was constantly confronted with, it frequently fell to the material world, which had this negative set of values placed on it that would drag the human being down, that would drag all of the creation down. So that's a way of saying that these other ways of thinking at the time could explain evil rather easily, right? It's the result of either this intransigent matter that just would resist God's best efforts at improving the world, or in some cases, there were other deities who were vying with the good God for dominance. So a Manichaean way of thinking, for instance, had a good God and an evil God who were kind of locked in combat for all eternity. So what I'm trying to get at here is they could explain evil, but they couldn't really, in any of those systems, give one a satisfactory way of thinking that it would ever be triumphed over. I mean, you had a good God and an evil God who were just going at it for all eternity. You can never proclaim with any kind of confidence that evil would be overcome. When Christianity puts forward the doctrine of creation out of nothing, it puts forward a view as God, author of all creation, God determining the very most fundamental features of the world being good through and through. With that claim, very naturally on the heels comes, well, there's how to explain evil. That becomes a real thorny problem. But ultimately, the proclamation within the Christian way of thinking is that precisely because God has made everything that is, has determined that reality through and through, we can indeed hope for a day when evil is triumphantly overcome. Other ways of thinking simply could not provide that message, could not provide that. So that's a bit of the framework that might do something for us in thinking about, okay, off at the eschaton, at the end of all things, there is indeed a triumph of good over evil. That may be of limited comfort to us in the here and now, in the time before having arrived at that conclusion. So there are a number of ways in which this issue is approached within Christian theology. One of them is called the soul-making defense of the problem of evil. And it seems to me, as mentioned briefly earlier, there's something like that that's in Frankl's considerations, what he's putting forward. And I should say quickly, of course, Frankl, coming from the Jewish context, makes for some important interreligious claims. You've got a situation where, historically speaking, at least, Christianity is making this proclamation, and then you have other monotheistic religions who are participating or articulating similar kinds of views. So that is to say, there's enormous compatibility, I think, between what Frankl gives us and what a Christian theologian will have to say, and what a Muslim theologian will have to say before, as another example. So the soul-making defense, then, of the problem of evil essentially says that we do indeed, of course, encounter evil, encounter suffering in our world. And this is by no means pleasant for us. But ultimately, such difficulties serve to make our souls. That we endure these trials and tribulations, but at the end of the day, we can sometimes only in hindsight see that those difficulties have in fact shaped us and shaped us in a better way. We've become, and you can fill in any number of adjectives, character attributes that one develops in the midst of this grappling. This is begun by, I think, Irenaeus, and the contemporary theologian named John Hick augments this view. Can be found at other instances between those two. And it can be, for many, I think, a rather powerful way of handling this thorny problem. So we are in the midst of suffering, we're in the midst of evil, absolutely. One has a consolation that one is somehow, in ways that might be difficult to identify in the moment, one is somehow becoming a better person through the midst of these difficulties. Our souls are forged in these fires. Now, I talk about this idea in my classes, I talk about this idea in other settings, and it's important to acknowledge, and this is where we get some really interesting conversation, I think, with what Frankl puts forward. It's important to acknowledge that as powerful as the soul-making defense can be for some, one should wield it with caution, I would say, in pastoral settings. So that is to say, if one is in the midst of suffering, to approach an individual in that position and issue assurances that could be perceived as far too glib, that one will in fact be made better by these kinds of situations. Lots of particulars to navigate, very, very good. And it should additionally be said that one critique of the soul-making defense is that in some instances, perhaps a large number of instances, it's very easy to imagine situations in which people don't actually improve because of their grappling with suffering. In other words, there's a critique of the soul-making defense that says, ultimately what it tries to do is to make evil into good. But yes, there was this saying that was perceived to be evil by you, but it served some good at the end of the day. And one can think of examples, and the Holocaust is frequently cited in these conversations, when the good that came out of that, very, very difficult to identify. So it puts us into some really difficult ground. The problem of evil and suffering in general puts us into difficult ground. The soul-making defense might be a balm to some. It might even give some a resource for thinking about how to navigate what could be an unendurable situation. Its applicability remains to be determined, right, on a case-by-case basis, one might say. So if that's the general background of the problem and at least one version of something approaching a solution, if we can even call it that, let's gesture now to Frankl's text, because as I say, I think he's in a rather profound conversation with these ways of thinking and with Nietzsche as well, that really can give us some resources for thinking about these issues in our climate and in our setting. The first thing I'd like to draw our attention to is the way in which Frankl, after page of, how do you even describe it? Inhuman, the term I used earlier, that's not wrong. It doesn't quite grasp it though, or convey it, right? I mean, just this systematic destruction, not only of the body, but of the mind, the attempted destruction of the mind and the heart, and the sadistic mechanisms that were deployed in order to do this. One can learn about these things, these events historically at one level, but then to be shown such an intimate psychological portrait of it all, I think, takes one's engagement with these issues or these events to a whole new level. And I want to kind of just put that before us, because as we move toward finding meaning in the midst of this, I don't want to ever underestimate or understate the horrors, absolute horrors that Frankl takes us through. So after we get a good 30 pages of this stripping away of all humanity, we start to get some glimmers of how in the world someone survives this. And perhaps it was the case for you, certainly the case for me, reading this text thinking, how would anyone endure this? We get a glimpse, an opening glimpse of what becomes, as I characterized it moments ago, I think a crescendo of resources, of ways of thinking, ways of living on the interior, you could say, that enable him and some of his fellow prisoners, at least, to navigate these challenges. The first glimpse, it seems to me, comes on page 34, and there's an excerpt there on a handout. Again, technically speaking, I'm at the edge of my page limit there, and then we go into things that are technically for future weeks, but I hope you won't mind. So this is the first idea that we get. And if you're wondering, how does he do this? How does anyone do this? We get this. Because in spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of the life in a concentration camp, it was possible for spiritual life to deepen. Sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered much pain. They were often of a delicate constitution. But the damage to their inner selves was less. They were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. And it seems to me that this moment in the text and the narrative inaugurates this idea that there are these physical conditions that are unimaginable. And it's the inner life, maintaining it, cultivating it, that will be the key for making it through. That inner life, Frankl develops in a lot of different ways to talk about essentially the ways in which one can keep something of oneself preserved. One of the ways, which was a kind of lighthearted moment after much grimness, concerns humor. And I found this just really fascinating, really capturing something, right? That it's through humor that one's humanity is retained. It's through humor that one manages to recall oneself. And it's a version of what becomes a theme in the text, namely the future that's envisioned, right? The future for which one lives, the future that keeps one going, in the midst of these unimaginable horrors. It's that future vision with a humorous twist that I think is welcome to the reader, certainly at this point in the narrative, and that is a rich resource for us to think about in our contemporary situation too. So he says this, he says, humor was another of the soul's weapon in the fight for self-preservation. It is well known that humor, more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds. I practically trained a friend of mine who worked next to me on the building site to develop a sense of humor. I suggested to him that we would promise each other to invent at least one amusing story daily about some incident that could happen one day after our liberation. And between the ellipses here, he invites his friend, who is a surgeon, to imagine being back in the operating room after having been liberated, and this phrase, this term, action, action, when one of the guards would enter a room, permeated camp life when one snapped to attention when action was said. And so that he imagines the surgeon in the midst of a procedure hearing this and snapping to attention. And then the other one, amusing to me, and maybe I hope we can convey how humorous it could be in what comes. He says, the other men invented amusing dreams about the future, such as forecasting that during a future dinner engagement, they might forget themselves when the soup was served and beg the hostess to ladle it from the bottom. So that soup was served from the bottom, had some peas in it, had some significantly greater nourishment in it than from the top, which was a watery, nearly nourishment-free material. So to be joking about, I mean, it's an incredible vision, right? Think about having the resources, the ability to crack jokes about begging a hostess in some fancy restaurant to give you soup from the bottom so that you can actually get something that's nourishing. I was thinking about how to categorize it. Gallows humor isn't quite the term for it, but it has a darkness, obviously, but it's making something, again, I would say something human out of that deeply difficult situation. So this becomes the beginning, it seems to me, of a theme that grows and grows. And one could encapsulate it by saying, Frankl is insisting to his reader that one always has a choice. One always has a choice for how one approaches these difficulties that is before one. And it's that choice, it's that ability to have an inner disposition, an inner life, to crack jokes, to make decisions in freedom that distinguish one from what would characterize it perhaps as the animal life that is being attempted on the part of those who are imprisoning the people in these camps. Right? They're trying to reduce them to the status of an animal, and that is resisted by having a choice. Having a choice. Your attitude toward your sufferings is where Frankl wants to say, no one can encroach on that, right? That is your kind of inviolable humanity that you can exert in the face of great difficulties, no doubt. But one has a choice. And he talks about that choice as in a lot of different ways. One of them concerns the choice to, under some conditions, preserve a very small piece of bread for a fellow prisoner, right? And the extraordinary gift that would be to that person if that person was sick in particular, but under other conditions as well. And that these ever so small moments are just filled with meaning, filled with significance, precisely because they make one different from that reduction to the material or that reduction to animal life. This is where humanity is found and maintained, and this is how one gets through. So as the crescendo builds, we get to one of two moments when Nietzsche is mentioned by name. And it has, in this instance, in the first instance, to do with the future goal, which we spoke about, if it's being in a restaurant, being served soup that's from the bottom, or what these futures were held out as lures or shining lights, one might say. And this was key, Frankl says, in terms of how one would approach this. So he says in the next quotation there, any attempt to restore a man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed in showing him some future goal. Nietzsche's words, he who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. Would be the guiding motto for all psychotherapeutic and psychohygienic efforts regarding prisoners. Whenever there was an opportunity for it, one had to give them a why and aim for their lives in order to strengthen them to bear the terrible how of their existence. Woe to him who saw no more sense in his life, no aim, no purpose, and therefore no point in carrying on. He was soon lost. You've got to have a why. And that why took different forms. It took the form of visions of being reunited with members of one's family, took other forms as well. But if that's what has to be done, if that's the telos or the goal toward which one is moving, one could, Frankl says, endure anyhow or any state of affairs. I mean, it's a profound comment, I think, on meaning. Right? The title of the text, Man's Search for Meaning. It was, we're just getting started with the series. I don't want to issue any spoilers for what's to come. But it's that meaning that makes all the difference. Having a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. And if one has that, one is willing, or not willing, one can endure any set of circumstances, Frankl says. I want to just record one more moment in the text, and then I hope we can open things up for conversation. Nietzsche, as is well known, has this phrase, that which does not kill me makes me stronger. And it's an encapsulation of his attitude. This is why he's so averse to or critical of this slave morality, as he puts it, because it's just kind of bemoaning every difficulty that comes one's way. Right? One is looking to cast blame on someone else. Whereas Nietzsche's attitude is just fundamentally different from this. He wants to say, yes, we endure difficulties. And if they don't completely take us out of this world, then they're going to make us better somehow. It's going to make us stronger. It's just an absolute polar opposite attitude toward life. It is certainly striking to me to see Frankl landing on this text and using it, appropriating it for the purposes of his own survival and those of his prisoners. So he says this, he says, once the meaning of suffering had been revealed to us, we refused to minimize or alleviate the camp's tortures by ignoring them or harboring false illusions and entertaining artificial optimism. Suffering had become a task on which we did not want to turn our backs. We had realized its hidden opportunities for achievement, the opportunities which caused the poet Rilke to write, "Wie viel ist aufzuleiden," how much suffering there is to get through. Rilke spoke of getting through suffering, as others would talk of getting through work. There was plenty of suffering for us to get through. Therefore, it was necessary to face up to the full amount of suffering, trying to keep moments of weakness and furtive tears to a minimum. There was no need to be ashamed of tears, for tears bore witness that the man had the greatest courage, the courage to suffer. Whatever we had gone through could still be an asset to us in the future. I quoted from Nietzsche, that which does not kill me makes me strong. This idea of getting to this point, and Frankl would acknowledge not everyone got to that point by any means, but getting to the point where one faces, as he puts it, the full amount of one's suffering and does not attempt to evade it or minimize it, but instead to take it on with the full confidence and the deep conviction that it will make one stronger, that one's, to use language to use at the outset here, it will forge the souls of those who are in the midst of these difficulties. So it's one thing for who to invoke the soul-making defense and say, yes, we encounter sufferings, but they make us better. It's quite another, it seems to me, for someone in the position of Viktor Frankl to make that claim. For many of us, not even be able to imagine at least the physical dimensions of the suffering that he endured. To have these words from him words to be put on, I suppose, inspiration, resource, something for us to consider. So, without by any means wanting to minimize the problem, we have here a profound grappling and putting forward of solutions too tidy, a way to put it, I don't know, but at least a set of ideas and a set of resources having ultimately to do with the humanity that can endure. The notion of having a reason for one's existence, a why for which one lives, coupled with the idea that the sufferings that we encounter are ultimately going to serve in our efforts at developing our efforts at becoming better people. I didn't, I'm running out of space here, but there are moments when he talks about these great achievements that these prisoners would pull off in the midst of incarceration, in the midst of these circumstances. And I quite liked his way of framing them as great achievements because they were, from one perspective, so very small. Providing a fellow prisoner with a piece of bread, maintaining an attitude that doesn't reduce one to the animal state. They could be viewed as virtually insignificant, but they're great achievements in as much as they preserve one's humanity. They keep one from dragged into a way of existence that will ultimately destroy one. So perhaps we can open things up to conversation now, and I realize we're in rather profound waters that might give one pause at saying anything in response to the problem of evil. Ultimately, I think our hope with this series is that there's no shortage of suffering in our time. We see a certainly extraordinary display of it in our read, but that it will, as I think Frankl wanted it, it will be something that we can draw from as we navigate the difficulties that we all face. That's it.
It's the word humanity a lot in a positive way. That this is the way to be sure humanity was by giving somebody a piece of bread, no matter how small. But the guards argument are going to show anything of humanity. And I think that's the challenge, right? How can we do that? And I was thinking about that when you were talking, and the word that came to my mind was connection. That by giving somebody something, you're connecting with them, you're not separating from them.
Right.
No matter how small it is. And I think when we talk about prayer, we talk about prayer as a form of connecting with God, connecting, with the spirit, the soul. And so that's a thought that comes to my mind as I hear you speak.
Yeah. I agree. I think connection is a major theme in the book. Humor is one form of that connection, right? Locating something in the other person that can be drawn out and that one can share. Connection concerning sustenance, concerning psychologically benefiting one. But yes, I agree. Connection is how so many manage to survive. Yeah.
There's another Holocaust account written by Piero Levi called "If This Be a Man," And the narrator gets it, the task that's different, which is the relief. Working with somebody else who he knew slightly in his former life in Italy. And they start to talk about Dante. And they start to talk about the Inferno, and this other man had memorized some of this, and they are talking back and forth as they have these wheelbarrows of refuse or whatever, this job that they're doing. And I've just never forgotten that image of, in the depths of despair, it's an intellectual, something beyond that material denial of everything. And it was just so inspiring to read about that particular example of how that could be.
Yeah, yeah. It's such a nice counterpoint to a perception that these things are luxuries, right? That learning some Dante or learning about the history of theology, philosophy, arts that has shaped our culture is something that one can kind of indulge in if one has the time. But the notion that it's integral to survival is certainly not routinely said. But here it's coming into play in this absolutely crucial way in these unimaginable circumstances to help people live through the forward. Okay.
I'd like to ask you a theological question, and you are a theologian. I am a theological dilettante, so please forgive me for oversimplifying, but is it true that in Reconstructionist Judaism, the omnipotence of God has been de-emphasized and the empathic God has been brought forward?
I think it's it's even more pervasive than that. It's across a range of religious traditions that yes, this has been so to
in an effort to explain
Yeah.
the Holocaust.
Yes, exactly. So what one does, one response to the Holocaust in particular, horrors of the 20th century more broadly, is to, as Mary was signaling, speak about a God who suffers with humanity, and that in some iterations is not the all-powerful entity that has been proclaimed for much of the history preceding the 20th century. It's an effort at, and it strikes me as very much in keeping with some of those ways of thinking around in the first few centuries of the Christian tradition of the Common Era, which do very similar things, right? Which say God is with us, God is deeply sympathizing with us, and Christology is often a resource that gets pulled from, not that one needs to go in that direction, but Reconstructionist Judaism, for instance. But the idea that God's suffering on the cross is a profound example of what we're talking about here. But what gets reduced then is the omnipotence of God, is the ability of God, God's self, to overcome this state of affairs. One can see it as emerging under the pressures of an intense problem. One has to wonder, as many do, so it takes a while for things to develop along these lines. But after a period of time of this emphasis, there starts to be worry about the kind of hope that can ultimately be proclaimed if one goes in that direction. So it solves one problem in terms of explaining how this could happen. It arguably bequeaths a different problem further down the line, you might say, in terms of what resolution can then be achieved. There's that when it gets taken up in Christian theological circles, there's some criticism. Jürgen Moltmann is a figure who will say some similar things, and one of the resistances to that or concerns about that puts it rather memorably. I think it says, if I'm in a prison, it is only of minimal consolation to think that God is in that prison with me. What would be of even greater consolation would be a God who could get me out of that prison. And so it just drives home the cost of compromising on divine omnipotence.
Yeah, so I can understand not wanting to talk about the 32 pages that we were supposed to read
Well,
and skipping past them all,
Yeah.
but going back and dwelling on those
Yeah.
particular pages, there, I think there's a lot of rich
Oh, yeah.
information. First of all, he talks about, you know, the delusions that everybody has that this isn't happening. So
Yeah.
if you were part of the group, the 40 people who went with us on the Sacred Sites tour last spring, you know that we have a concentration camp site down at Fort Snelling State Park, where hundreds of indigenous people were brutalized, as much the same here. They, you know, the food, they were dying from disease. They, you know, there was no care given to them. And we like to just gloss over that part. So again, like, you know, I don't want to talk about the first 30 pages, but the thing that struck me most in these first 30 pages, he says, we will
Which
come
page are you
back-
on? Where are you? What-
Oh, page 5. At the bottom of the penultimate paragraph, we who have come back by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return. And what struck me about that is, so he's writing about that, he's recognizing that. And I had read it another place, the people who had lived through the Holocaust, these people who had survived, when they get to be older people, our age type people, they killed themselves. Primo Levi.
Yes.
And, you know, they were trying to say, why was that going on? And it was like, oh, nobody's listening to us when we're trying to explain these horrors. That may be it. Or it may be that, you know, they finally come to recognize that, you know, what I did to survive, it just wasn't worth it. And so, I guess that's the point, is the point I'm trying to make is that in these first 30 pages, he talks a lot about the terrible things that we humans do to each other. And not just the Nazis, but the 7th Cavalry down in, or whatever militia it was that, you know, and there are other places where the comparable concentration camps happened. With the torture and suffering the prisoners of war in Korea, in the Korean War, had to go through. You know, and it's just, yeah, and how to, you know, back to your point of, you know, how do we sync that up with the loving God, our concept of loving God? And I have no answers. I just want to sit with the questions. That's kind of why we get land.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. No, that you mentioned that there's a lot there, Dan. You mentioned things that we absolutely have to always have in our minds. One concerns that this is not the National Socialists alone who enacted this, that this is a veritable refrain throughout human history, right? And second, as you gestured toward the best of us did not return, right? The idea that we tried to do some justice to at the beginning with the critique of the soul-making defense, says some people's souls might be formed, others are utterly obliterated. And one has to keep that in mind. Where that leaves one, I think, a profound state of questioning is an appropriate one. And one cannot ever too glibly put forward any kind of resolution would be way too strong. But I suppose what is striking to me is the way in which Frankl, acutely aware of all this, is able to articulate what he does, right? So he's, in other words, he's not shying away from the problem in any way, shape, or form. Gianna, I thought I saw you. Oh, Cynthia.
Just 2 things briefly. How long after his experience did you write the book?
Almost immediately.
I thought so.
I think it was, some of it was
I-
contemporaneous, right, with his.
I thought so,
yeah,
because
keeping it.
one of the things that just hit me as I was reading was, I just couldn't help but wonder how much of these thoughts, later reflection on the experience, and then I was wondering if he knew at the time the importance of the interiority.
Yeah.
The second thing is, it's very meaningful for me to think about God suffering with us. Pastorally, it doesn't always work. one of the worst things I ever experienced was doing the last rites for a baby. And I mean, it was terrible, and I think I may have uttered 4 words. But God suffering with us, and the mother said, I'm cleaning it up a little. Don't give me that. I mean, she was not in a place where she could hear that. And that was something that, you know, I really took me aback, and I have really had to think about.
Right.
So that maybe sometime she came to that, maybe another time, maybe she didn't. So no, I don't know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's a good reminder or lesson that, you know, we're talking kind of big picture ideas here, you know, large blocks, as it were, which applying that to any particular pastoral situation requires the utmost attention to the particulars. Chris, did I see you?
2 things that struck me, one is his powers of observation. I mean, it's the smallest thing in that, he just took it in and wrote it down or somehow remembered it. I mean, the idea of when you stop trading the cigarettes for food and start smoking, that was the beginning of the end. I mean, that really struck me. The other thing that came to mind is a number of years ago, I think late 90s, early 2000s, a small book came out with a Bible study called Sleeping with Bread, and the title just captured me. Was written by a local author, Matt Lynn, Linn. And if you're familiar with it, the idea came from they were working with a group of malnourished children that had gone through again trauma or suffering of some sort. And they started by feeding them and doing it the right way, introducing them to certain foods that they could digest and so forth. But they didn't seem to be getting any better. And finally, they finally said, well, let's give them what they need. And they ended up sleeping with a piece of bread. They were so psychologically traumatized by not knowing if they would have any food for the next day, that until they started healing their psyche, they weren't getting physically better. And so they're so connected that I don't think we can separate them in the midst of this.
Right, yeah. And Frankl makes some points along those lines at multiple junctures, right? It's the absolutely crucial role that inner life, that the psychological, emotional, spiritual has to play in the overall health of the human being. That it's not simply a matter of attending to physical needs. Yeah, Jim.
I was struck by the intellect, and my first reaction was, this is privilege. You to grasp this, all these small, big and very small things took a lot of intellect. I felt like I was listening to a lecture that was really wonderful. And then I started to think of the examples in life. My cousin, who was born 2 months after her father had been killed in World War II. And the example of her mother was just so powerful for all of us. She was the most positive, wonderful, giving, loving person, and she suffered what, to me, and here she was, 8 months, 7 months pregnant with her child. And she was a focal point for our family, and I really think that's the answer for her. She was my mother's. My mother was one of 3 daughters, and she was younger sister, and it's just such a strong example. So the message to me quickly was, it doesn't take a PhD in psychology to get it, but it's a gift to be able to do that. And I felt gifted by this learning, but it's so suffering, it's so difficult for me. And the other thing I'm often struck by and by our circumstance is the suffering of racism. Is constant. is constant when the president of the United States can be followed in a department store. That's just a small example. It's everywhere all the time, and that's just awful suffering. And how can people live through that? And constructively, meaningful. And we do have wonderful examples of people of color who are coming through it.
Thank you, Jan. There's a lot there. I mean, one thing maybe to highlight concerns, I agree that Frankl is coming from, as you put it, a position of privilege, having great learning and all this. I mean, what's striking to me is the way in which he used that position of privilege to attend to the needs of those who were just in desperate situations, right? So by no means was it a kind of off in the stratosphere thinking about these various things. And he was putting these ideas to use in the moment, and no doubt saved any number of lives through
And his own establishing relationships.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, Holly.
This came to me when Betsy, who I'm sorry is not any longer in the room, said something about connection. And I began to think about the fact that all of his experience with these, I mean, the experience of everyone in that situation was literally close. I mean, their connection was bodily, boom,
Yes.
close,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And how often do we experience anything, whether it's suffering or joy, with that many people that are close?
Right.
And when we are close to someone, it is typically someone we love or know well enough to be that physically close.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the fact that he took a deep dive inside and to think about his soul, I was wondering how much of that might have been because of the physicality of the closeness of this.
That's a really, really nice point. And it's something of a counterpoint to the idea that the inner life is kind of in distinction to the exterior, right? To say that there are some, at least physical circumstances, practices even, that could have fostered the sense of connection, right? I mean, sleeping with however many other people in a absurdly small bed, that constant proximity, you're giving us an intriguing thought that it could have actually fostered a sense of community, a sense of connection that could have served the inner life that was also cultivated as well. So in other words, it's not that the inner life is in resistance to the outer completely. It's that it gets shaped by the outer, in particular that proximity to other human beings. We should end at least this session, but by no means have we finished with the issues on the table. We'll be exploring them for a number of weeks to come. As we close, let's briefly end in prayer. The Lord be with you.
No,
Gracious God, you give our lives meaning. In that meaning, we find the ability to endure. I ask that you keep us mindful of our connection with one another, the importance of cultivating our inner lives, the ultimate grounds for hope that we can find in you. In the holy name we pray. Thank you all for seeing you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's another comment in here where he's talking about, it was a pretty horrible.
Is that a big
In
a high environment or
The reality we want to comfort somebody, but there's nothing. There, you know, this is just terrible. And all we can say is, it is terrible. There's nothing you can. No, I just saw, we play The Life of Pi. And I don't know if you remember the story. The story is a 17-year-old boy survives 279 days crossing the Pacific Ocean. And they asked him, well, what happened? He tells this fantastic story filled with a Bengal tiger and all that stuff. And the insurance agent said, you know, that's crazy. This can't possibly, you know, and he says, oh, so you want a different story? And so he tells them an even more horrific story. You know, about his mother being killed by his, you know, it was like such a, you know, which story do you like? I like the Bengal tiger.
Yeah. It is such a good illustration.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. Anyway,
I have, yeah, I need to go back. It's been a while. Right.
And what he
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, I'll have to.
So.
Well, the other thing I did is at the beginning of COVID, you know, they mentioned this book at the end here.
That's exactly what my.
Yes, my wife is. Actually, he gave.
So again, the humor part,
Yes.
but the very real.
I really need to get.
Yeah. So this was, you know, soon after the inauguration. It's just like, yeah, it was just craziness, but, and you read that's one place.
Thanks for your help with that.
You're welcome. I highly recommend it. Did you find out? I have a paperback version. You pick up on the bottom of page 44. Just look at that.
Okay.
Little teaser.
Okay.
Thank you.
Somebody else.
It's a big one.
Small things. Whatever it is. We don't do it into the.
Sure, and it's some kind of reference. So works.
So somebody was on the equation. It goes on and on, it's like. Other one, my girl. Goes on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not a lot of that.
Goes on.
Yeah, that's usually not.
My only person, the family that's almost, that actually at one point.
Yeah.
Oh, Mary.
And I thought I was, I will, I'll take my day, you know, and the thing is, I didn't. Once that Mary will show you.
I have the old natural. I don't see the song.
The one that.
Church.
That was talking about.
And then they'll.
Yeah. Okay, so. I saw it very, very. Yeah. It looks good. It looks good. I like it all very unusual.
Directed by Eric Stiles, who have a Catholic Church of Founders. It wasn't my choice. I began with the Catholics that filled the hall on Marshall, just over the cathedral. They gave me my own thing with them. My own room, my own bathroom. Everybody else